The digital clock on the school nurse's desk flipped to 10:14 a.m. just as Karen's phone let out a low, distorted chime. She didn't see the text, but she felt the sudden, icy silence that swept through the hallway outside her office. Seconds later, the heavy oak door creaked open, and her principal stood there, trembling, holding a tablet that displayed a video of Karen's own face, distorted with a rage she didn't recognize, screaming threats into a camera she had never seen. Before Karen could draw a breath to protest, the school's intercom system screeched to life, broadcasting her own voice in a jagged, hateful loop that she knew she had never recorded. By the time she reached her driveway, the world had already rewritten her. Her key turned in the lock, but the tumblers remained frozen. Her smart home system pulsed a mocking, rhythmic red from the porch light. Through the living room window, she saw two strangers in dark suits calmly packing her daughter's favorite stuffed rabbit into a sterile plastic crate, while a police officer held a tablet showing Karen's official psychiatric commitment papers, signed in her own unmistakable handwriting. The rain began to turn to sleet, stinging her skin, but the cold inside was worse. Every screen in her life was now a weapon, and according to the data, Karen Whitman no longer had a right to exist. Karen Whitman pressed the cold, circular head of the stethoscope against the small, shivering back of a first grader. The child, a boy named Leo, smelled faintly of laundry detergent and the peanut butter sandwich he'd eaten at lunch. Within the confines of the medical office, the air held its usual sterile cocktail: the sharp tang of isopropyl alcohol, the dusty scent of chalk from the nearby classrooms, and the underlying metallic odor of the radiator. Outside the window, Duluth remained trapped under a heavy shroud of gray fog, the kind that rolled in off Lake Superior and refused to leave. Fine droplets of rain drummed a relentless, rhythmic tattoo against the glass. Karen made a precise notation in her logbook, her ears tuned to the familiar, comforting cacophony of the school corridor. The distant, muffled shouts of children and the rhythmic squeak of rubber outsoles against polished green linoleum. Her smartphone, resting on the desk near a stack of immunization records, vibrated with a sudden notification. Karen ignored it. She adjusted the crisp, white fabric of her nurse's lab coat and reached into a plastic bin for a holographic superhero sticker, a reward for her brave patient. The mercury in the thermometer she'd used earlier sat frozen at a perfect 98.6. It was a standard Tuesday, flowing by under the steady, mechanical ticking of the wall clock. Later that afternoon, Karen maneuvered her grocery cart through the aisles of a local supermarket, the wheels rattling against the tile. She pushed the cart toward the checkout lane, her mind already calculating the time needed to pick up Maya. The cashier, a woman with tired eyes behind thick, distorting lenses, swiped a gallon of milk and a box of oatmeal across the scanner with practiced apathy. Karen reached for her wallet and tapped her primary debit card against the terminal, expecting the usual confirmation chirp. Instead, the screen erupted in a harsh, crimson glow. The word "declined" stared back at her in blocky, uncompromising letters. A small frown creased Karen's brow as she produced a second card, then a third. Each attempt met the same digital wall. With a mounting sense of unease, she pulled out her phone to check her banking app. Her fingers trembled, fumbling against the glass, as a system message flickered onto the display. Access to accounts restricted. Contact your financial institution. Behind her, the line of shoppers began to hum with a low, impatient energy. Karen felt a thin, icy film of sweat break out across her temples. The cashier watched her with growing suspicion, the silence between them stretching thin and brittle under the hum of the fluorescent lights. The next morning, the atmosphere in the school changed from mundane to suffocating. Margaret O'Connor, the school principal, sat behind her mahogany desk, her face a mask of profound disappointment. Without a word, she dropped a thick stack of papers onto the blotter. The pages were covered in dense, black text. Karen leaned forward, her eyes scanning the lines, and felt the blood drain from her face. The documents were printouts of emails sent from her official school account. Vicious, profanity-laced tirades directed at the administration and her fellow teachers. The language was foul, a stream of vitriol that Karen would never even think, let alone type. Her throat went bone dry, the air in the office suddenly too thick to breathe. Margaret crossed her arms over her chest, her gaze sharp and filled with a cold, simmering loathing. Karen tried to find her voice, to explain the impossibility of it, but the words withered in her mouth. She looked at the timestamps. The messages had been sent barely an hour ago, during the exact window when she had been cleaning a playground scrape for a sobbing fourth grader. Her own avatar stared back from the header of every hateful message. The walls of the office felt as though they were physically contracting. The roar of blood in Karen's ears grew so loud, it nearly drowned out Margaret's dry, brittle voice, demanding that she surrender her keys and leave the premises immediately. Karen practically fell through her front door, her chest heaving as she collapsed onto the living room sofa. She clutched her laptop like a shield, the screen's cold, blue light stinging her tired eyes. She typed her email password with frantic, stabbing motions, but the system rejected it with a mocking red prompt. She pivoted to her social media accounts, but the result remained the same: a digital lockout. A notification window popped up, sliding into view with a soft chime that sounded like a funeral bell. Password changed 30 minutes ago from an unrecognized location. Karen's breath came in short, jagged gasps as she hammered at the keys, trying to trigger the security questions. She typed her mother's maiden name, a fact as solid as stone, but the screen flashed incorrect. She sat in the sudden, oppressive silence of her apartment. The only sound the frantic thrum of her own heart and the low, mechanical whir of the computer's cooling fan. Her entire digital existence was collapsing, folding in on itself until she was left on the outside of a fortress she had built. By the time she reached the school gates to pick up Maya, Karen's nerves were frayed to the breaking point. She stood by the iron fence, her fingernails digging deep into the palms of her hands until the skin broke. When Maya finally skipped out onto the porch, her pigtails bouncing, Karen forced her facial muscles into a stiff, artificial smile. She grabbed her daughter's pink backpack and took the girl's small hand in a grip that was perhaps a little too tight. Maya began to chatter happily about a drawing she'd made in art class. But Karen wasn't listening. Her eyes scanned the perimeter, searching for a hidden threat in every passing car and every stranger on the sidewalk. The muscles in her shoulders felt like they had been replaced with cold granite. Once they were inside the car, Karen twisted the volume knob on the radio, letting a loud pop song fill the cabin so Maya wouldn't hear the ragged, shallow quality of her mother's breathing. She drove with agonizing care, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, trying to suppress the primal panic that was vibrating through every cell in her body. Night fell over Duluth, casting the kitchen in long, distorted shadows. Karen sat at the table, the only light coming from her smartphone as it buzzed with a message from an anonymous sender. She tapped the link and froze. The video that played was a nightmare rendered in high definition. A woman who wore Karen's face, dressed in the very same navy blue cardigan she'd worn yesterday, stood in a hallway. Her mouth was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage as she screamed at Maya. The digital doppelganger lunged forward, shoving the child hard enough to send her sprawling across the floor. The sound was the worst part. A shrill, piercing version of Karen's own voice, shrieking curses that made her skin crawl. The real Karen let the phone slip from her numb fingers, the device clattering onto the tile floor. Maya was safely asleep in the next room. Yet Karen stared at her own trembling hands, unable to comprehend how a collection of pixels could mimic the exact placement of the mole on her cheek or the specific green of her eyes. The silence of the house was shattered by the violent, splintering crash of the front door being forced off its hinges. Karen bolted upright, her instincts screaming as she threw her body in front of Maya's bedroom door. Two police officers in dark, tactical uniforms charged into the foyer, followed closely by a woman in a sharp, slate-gray suit, a social worker from the Department of Children and Families. Karen saw the dull glint of handcuffs on the lead officer's belt and felt a wave of nausea. Maya began to wail, a high-pitched, terrifying sound as she clutched at the hem of Karen's pajamas. The officer stepped forward, his hand raised in a sharp command for Karen to move away from the child. Karen screamed for an explanation, her voice cracking with desperation. But the social worker merely unfolded a legal document bearing a heavy, official seal. The air in the house suddenly smelled of the damp rain from outside and the cold, ozone scent of authority. Karen felt the floor beneath her feet turn into liquid, the world tilting on its axis. The officer held a tablet inches from Karen's face, the screen glowing with medical records she had never seen before. The logo of the Duluth City Clinic was clearly visible at the top of the page. Karen's eyes darted across the text, picking out phrases that chilled her to the bone. Acute psychotic disorder with aggressive tendencies. Risk to self and others. The reports listed specific dates for consultations she had never attended and prescriptions for potent antipsychotics she had never touched. Karen shook her head, a desperate denial forming in her throat. But the officer tapped the bottom of the screen. There, in the signature line, was her own electronic scrawl. It was perfect. Every loop and slant identical to her own handwriting. The realization hit her like a physical blow. To the eyes of the law, she was a documented madwoman. The officer tucked the tablet back into his belt and took a decisive step toward Maya, who was now huddled, sobbing, on the edge of the sofa. Strong hands clamped around Karen's wrists, pinning her against the wall with brutal efficiency. She thrashed against the officer's weight, her eyes wide as she watched the social worker guide Maya toward the shattered front door. Maya reached back, her small hands clawing at the air, her cries dissolving into a ragged, breathless hitch. Karen begged them to listen, her voice a raw, guttural plea, testifying that the videos and the records were elaborate fakes. The door of the patrol car shut with a heavy, final thud that seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the house. Through the rear window, Karen caught one last glimpse of Maya's pale, tear-streaked face pressed against the glass. The whirling blue and red lights of the police cruisers painted the walls of her home in a frantic, strobe-like rhythm. Karen's strength vanished, her body going limp in the officer's grasp as she watched the taillights of the car disappear into the dark, rainy street, taking her daughter into a void she couldn't reach. An hour later, Karen stumbled into the police precinct, her face a smeared mess of tears and mascara. She approached the duty officer behind the thick, scratched plexiglass, her words coming out in a frantic, incoherent stream. She talked about digital hacking, about deepfakes, about her bank accounts being drained. The officer didn't even bother to look up from his monitor. He typed her name into the system with slow, methodical keystrokes. Suddenly, his posture stiffened. He turned the monitor toward her, revealing a file overflowing with reports of erratic behavior, public disturbances, and threats. Karen reached through the small opening at the bottom of the glass, trying to grab his arm in a desperate bid for attention. But he jerked back as if she were infectious. He told her, in a voice devoid of empathy, that she should leave before he processed her for a breach of the peace. He returned to his paperwork, his silence a final, impenetrable wall. Karen walked out onto the cold, midnight street and collapsed onto a wooden bench beneath a flickering street lamp. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking so hard she almost dropped it. Her name was trending in the local news feeds. The headlines were sensational, screaming about a psychotic school nurse and child at risk. Beneath the articles, hundreds of comments from people she had known for years, neighbors, parents, former friends, called for her head. She realized with a sickening clarity that in the span of a few hours, an invisible force had systematically erased the woman she was and replaced her with a digital monster. She no longer existed as a respected professional or a devoted mother. To the world, she was nothing more than a dangerous glitch in the social fabric. She looked down at her empty, trembling hands, feeling a cold, absolute loneliness settle into her bones while the city slept around her. She drove back to her house, but she didn't go inside. Instead, she entered the garage, where the air smelled of gasoline and old dust. She moved to a workbench in the corner and pulled out a hidden, weathered sports bag. Inside, she found a thick stack of cash she'd been hoarding for years and a folder containing Maya's original paper birth certificate. She tore a gold chain from her neck, the last piece of jewelry she owned, and tossed it into the bag along with a change of practical clothes. With a grim set to her jaw, she disabled the GPS on her phone and snapped the SIM card in half, the plastic clicking as it broke. The law was no longer her ally. It was the weapon being used against her. She gripped the strap of the bag, her eyes losing their softness and turning into flint. Karen Whitman was gone. In her place was a shadow, and that shadow would do whatever was necessary to bring Maya home. The next morning, Karen parked her SUV in the deep shadows cast by a row of rusted shipping containers on the desolate outskirts of Duluth. She left the keys in the ignition, a gift for whatever thief found it first. A biting wind howled through the empty, shattered windows of the nearby warehouses. She counted out a handful of crumpled bills and handed them to a man with a thick, greasy beard and a stained cap. He spat on the cracked asphalt and tossed her a heavy ring of keys. The vehicle he offered was a battered Ford van with peeling white paint and a dented side panel. The interior smelled of stale tobacco and old engine oil. Karen climbed inside and turned the key, listening to the engine's ragged, hacking cough before it finally sputtered to life. The van lurched forward, trailing a cloud of blue smoke as she drove onto the potholed road and vanished into the gray, pre-dawn mist of the industrial zone. She navigated the van through a maze of construction debris to reach a heavy steel door at the back of a derelict warehouse. Inside, the cavernous space was illuminated only by the cool, flickering blue glow of a dozen high-end monitors. The air was dry and hummed with the static of heavy-duty processors. A man named Marcus sat in a deep, ergonomic chair, his silhouette framed by a chaotic web of black cables. He didn't turn around when she entered, but the way his shoulders tensed told Karen he had been expecting her. The smell of hot plastic and burnt coffee hung heavy in the air. Marcus finally nodded toward a nearby stool, his fingers never stopping their rhythmic dance across the mechanical keyboard, filling the room with a rapid-fire staccato of clicks. Marcus plugged a data cable into Karen's tablet, and the monitors around them immediately erupted into a cascading waterfall of complex diagrams and scrolling text. In the center of the largest screen, a crimson logo pulsed, a stylized shield. Karen leaned in, her eyes tracing the jagged structure of the code that had dismantled her life. Within the lines of the algorithm, she saw a hidden digital watermark, Aegis Alpha. Marcus zoomed in on a specific block of logic, revealing the encrypted signature of the Aegis Corporation. A chill that had nothing to do with the warehouse's temperature crawled down Karen's spine. She knew this digital handwriting. It was the same architecture she had helped build a decade ago for a project that was supposed to have been buried forever. Karen closed her eyes for a moment, reaching back into a part of her mind she had tried to seal off. She saw the strings of characters, the back doors she had once coded into the system. Her fingers hovered over Marcus's keyboard before she began to type. A long, complex string of Latin phrases and randomized numbers. An authorization window flickered onto the screen, demanding a legacy military protocol. She hit Enter, and the silence of the warehouse was broken by the low, powerful thrum of a remote server waking up. Marcus's eyebrows shot up as a directory tree labeled Project Jericho expanded across the display. Karen saw an old, grainy photo of herself in a tactical uniform. The past she had fled was now laid bare on the screen, its secrets uncoiling like a nest of snakes. Marcus scrolled through page after page of documents where neural network schematics were interspersed with Aegis's internal financial ledgers. Karen watched as their old research into predictive behavioral analysis was revealed to be the foundation for a global surveillance apparatus. On blueprints dated from only a year ago, she recognized modernized versions of the tracking modules she and Marcus had designed to find high-value targets. Now, those same algorithms were being used to hunt ordinary citizens. Marcus pointed to a section titled Social Filtration, where Aegis was described as the primary architect of perceived reality. Karen clenched her fists, her knuckles turning white. Her life's work had been twisted into a digital guillotine, capable of erasing a person from existence with a single keystroke. A new tab labeled Active Threats appeared on the screen. Karen's own face stared back from the center of a pulsing red circle. Next to the image, a status indicator blinked. Survivor error. Priority. Total liquidation. She read through the operational directives. The destruction of all digital backups, the freezing of all assets, and the physical recovery of biological material. At the bottom of the page, a high-resolution photo of Maya appeared with the designation Subject Zeta. A metallic taste of pure, unadulterated fury filled Karen's mouth. Aegis didn't just want to punish her. They had classified her as a software bug that needed to be purged from the system to ensure the seamless operation of their world-shaping algorithm. Suddenly, the warehouse was bathed in the harsh, rotating glow of an emergency red light. Marcus's monitors began to scream with proximity alerts. Outside, the screech of tires and the heavy thud of van doors echoed through the thin walls. Beams of high-intensity light cut through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, sweeping across the room. Karen grabbed Marcus by the shoulder, forcing him to shove his laptop into a bag. A mechanical voice, amplified by a megaphone, boomed from the street, ordering Karen Whitman to surrender. She shoved Marcus toward a narrow crawl space hidden behind a stack of rusted engine parts. The front door of the warehouse buckled under a battering ram, just as Karen and Marcus scrambled out into a damp, trash-strewn alleyway. Karen pressed her back against the freezing brickwork of the alley, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. A few yards away, a thin red line of a laser sight sliced through the fog, searching for a target. She watched as Aegis operatives, clad in matte black armor and thermal imaging goggles, moved with predatory grace. She held her breath, her body turning to stone. One of the men stopped, his weapon sweeping the shadows. The green glow of his goggles made him look like a monster from a low-budget horror film. Karen's hand moved slowly, her fingers closing around a heavy, rusted length of rebar lying in the muck. Behind her, Marcus whispered a frantic, silent prayer as the elongated shadows of the operatives stretched across the wet asphalt toward them. Karen whispered a sharp command for Marcus to bypass the city's encrypted network using his portable terminal. He fumbled with the keys, his breath hitching, while Karen kept watch on the street corner. A mosaic of grainy CCTV feeds from across Duluth flickered onto the small screen. She searched for the black, unmarked van she had seen earlier near the Child Services building. Marcus initiated a broad-spectrum search based on the vehicle's transponder signature. A bright dot began to pulse on a digital map. The van was speeding through the intersection of Fifth Avenue, heading toward the rugged, forested cliffs to the north. Marcus confirmed the destination, a restricted zone that didn't appear on any civilian GPS. The terminal displayed a three-dimensional wireframe of a massive concrete structure buried deep within the woods. The label read, Aegis Genesis Research Complex. Marcus tapped the screen, indicating that Maya had been moved to Sector B, a wing dedicated to deep neural mapping. Karen stared at the schematics of laboratories filled with experimental hardware. Marcus explained that Aegis was searching for a specific genetic sequence, a biological kill switch that had been integrated into the Jericho project as a failsafe. Maya wasn't just a hostage. She was a biological key that could either stabilize the global algorithm or tear it apart. Aegis had stolen her child to harvest the final piece of their digital empire, and Karen knew they wouldn't wait long to start the extraction. Karen looked at the decoded DNA markers Marcus had pulled from the Aegis servers. The pieces of the puzzle finally locked into place. Aegis didn't need her. They needed the result of her participation in the Jericho experiments. Maya had inherited a unique neural plasticity, a brain capable of resisting the very cognitive manipulation the Aegis algorithms relied on. To the corporation, Maya was nothing more than raw material for a final system patch. If they completed the scan, the ability for any human to think an independent thought would be lost forever. The fear that had been paralyzing Karen was suddenly replaced by a cold, surgical resolve. She knew the weaknesses of this system better than anyone, because she had been there when the first lines of its code were written. Karen reached into the back of the Ford van and pulled out a tactical bag Marcus had hidden in his stash. She pulled on a black jacket with a discarded Aegis security patch and checked the weight of a handgun before sliding it into a holster. Marcus spread a blueprint of the headquarters across the hood of the van, marking the entry points and the blind spots in the camera coverage. Karen checked the magazine of her weapon, the metallic click echoing in the quiet of the woods. The air smelled of ozone and damp earth, the atmosphere thick with the electric tension of an approaching storm. The battered Ford came to a halt in the deep shadow of a towering pine tree, 50 yards short of a massive steel gate. Karen gripped a stolen holographic ID card, its surface shimmering with a fake Aegis logo. She rolled the van forward toward the security terminal, her skin prickling under her heavy jacket. She pressed the chip against the reader. The following silence was agonizing as a red scanner eye tracked the magnetic strip. A short, electronic chirp signaled approval, and the massive gates began to grind open. Karen eased the van forward, passing through concrete fortifications where the silhouettes of automated turrets were visible behind reinforced glass. Minutes later, Karen was on her knees in the damp, lightless crawlspace of the basement level. The air was thick with the smell of wet dust and the hum of high-voltage power lines. She pried off a maintenance panel, revealing a chaotic nest of colored wires. Her fingers, steady despite the adrenaline, inserted Marcus's transmitter into a service port. A small blue LED on the device blinked 3 times. On the other side of the wall, the thin red lines of the laser security grid flickered and died. The only sounds were the distant drone of a transformer and the rhythmic echo of Karen's own breathing against the cold concrete. She hauled herself up into the cramped, vibrating metal of a ventilation duct. The air from the building's massive turbines blasted against her face, cold and smelling of sterile plastic. A semi-transparent map, projected by her tactical glasses, overlaid the dark tunnel. She crawled on her elbows, following a pulsing green cursor that led toward the administrative block. Through the slats of a vent below her, she heard the rhythmic thud of heavy boots and the muffled chatter of a security patrol. She froze, pressing her body into the vibrating steel until the sounds faded into the distance. Karen kicked out a ventilation grate and dropped silently onto the thick carpet of the executive wing. As she rounded a corner, a massive guard appeared, his hand moving toward his holster. Karen lunged, her arm wrapping around his throat before he could make a sound. She used his own momentum to slam him against the wall, delivering a precise strike to the base of his skull. He slumped to the floor, his breathing heavy and ragged. She stripped a gold-embossed Level 5 keycard from his belt and checked the hallway's reflection in a wall-mounted clock before sprinting toward the heavy, airtight doors of the laboratory sector. She found herself in a cavernous room where rows of server racks glowed with an eerie, violet light. She jammed a portable drive into the central console, and the screen erupted into a frantic scroll of data. She watched the progress bar as it began to ingest terabytes of Aegis's most sensitive algorithms. The floor beneath her feet vibrated as the cooling systems ramped up to handle the massive data transfer. In the silence of the server room, she could hear the snap of static electricity. She watched the numbers climb, knowing that every megabyte she stole was a nail in the corporation's coffin. Her hand accidentally brushed a secondary touch panel, and a nearby monitor flared to life. Karen's breath caught. Maya was on the screen. The girl lay on a white bed in a room that was blindingly bright, her head enveloped in a complex web of electrodes and transparent tubes. On the monitors surrounding her, the jagged lines of a frantic heart rate pulsed in time with a digital metronome. Karen pressed her hand against the glass, her fingers trembling as she tried to reach through the pixels. Maya looked so small, a fragile ghost in a room of cold chrome and glass. The fear that had been haunting Karen for days finally crystallized into a hard, diamond-sharp rage. Karen scrolled through the technical specs of the live processor project that had appeared on the screen. The schematics were horrifying. Maya's brain was being mapped to serve as the biological core for the next generation of the Aegis network. The girl's individuality was being calculated as computational overhead. The system was designed to strip away her personality until only a stream of data remained. A chart showed the rate of neural degradation. Maya had less than an hour before the process became irreversible. Karen's jaw tightened until it ached. She reached out and violently yanked the drive from the console. She hammered a sequence of override commands into the terminal, her fingers flying across the keys. She triggered the fire suppression system for the entire sector. Immediately, a deluge of thick, white chemical foam and freezing water erupted from the ceiling, turning the hallways into a blinding white chaos. Alarms began to wail, and the heavy thud of emergency shutters echoed through the vents. Karen hit enter one last time, causing a massive surge in the local power grid that sent sparks showering from the overhead lights. She pulled her hood up and sprinted out of the server room, guided through the artificial fog by Marcus's voice in her ear. She burst into the medical block, where the visibility was near zero. Through the swirling white mist, she spotted the neon glow of the electronic lock on Maya's room. She raised her weapon and fired twice into the plastic housing of the terminal. Sparks sprayed across the floor, and the smell of burnt electronics filled the air. The heavy door hissed open. Karen slid across the wet floor into the room. Maya was still strapped to the bed, surrounded by figures in hazmat suits whose outlines were blurred by the steam. Karen leveled her gun at the lead surgeon, whose gloved hands were hovering over a control interface. She screamed for him to disconnect the girl, her voice a raw, jagged edge that cut through the roar of the sirens. The medical staff backed away, their hands raised in terror. One man reached for a red alarm button, and Karen sent a bullet into the console inches from his hand. Under the threat of her weapon, the surgeon began to pull the sensor cables from the back of Maya's head. Karen watched every move until the neural activity monitors went flat. Maya let out a soft, broken moan, and Karen shoved the doctors aside to reach her. She scooped Maya's limp, shivering body into her arms, tucking the girl's head against her shoulder. Maya smelled of antiseptic and terror. Karen turned toward the door and stopped dead. A silhouette stood in the doorway, framed by the swirling white vapor. It was Arthur Grant, her mentor from the Jericho days. Behind him, 6 tactical operatives raised their rifles, the red dots of their laser sights dancing across Karen's chest. Grant looked at her with a cold, detached pity. Maya whimpered, her small hands clutching Karen's jacket. Karen tightened her grip on her daughter and her gun, stepping back to shield the child with her own body. Karen slowly raised the tablet strapped to her wrist. On the screen, a large red button labeled Scorched Earth was flashing. She looked Grant in the eye and told him that one tap would execute a script to wipe every Aegis server on the planet, including the off-site backups. She saw the color drain from Grant's face, and the operatives behind him wavered, their rifles dipping slightly. Karen took a deliberate step forward. Grant spread his hands in a gesture of feigned peace, his voice smooth and calculated as it echoed in the sterile room. He began to talk of the future, promising Karen a clean slate, a new identity, a restored nursing license, and a quiet house far from the reach of the law. He pulled a gold stylus from his pocket, pointing toward her tablet as if offering a pen to sign a contract. Karen saw the way his eyes darted toward the data port, waiting for her to falter. He was offering her a comfortable cage in exchange for the world's freedom. Karen looked down at Maya. The girl's skin was the color of ash, and her eyes were moving frantically under her closed lids, still trapped in the echoes of the neural scan. Karen felt the cold dampness of Maya's forehead against her neck and knew that Grant's promises were just more lines of deceptive code. If she took the deal, Maya would never truly be free. She would be a priority asset for the rest of her life. Karen's gaze hardened. She realized that any bargain with a man like Grant was just another way to tighten the noose. She slammed her thumb down on the tablet's screen. The display turned a deep, bruised purple as the Omega virus began its work, eating through the Aegis core directory by directory. A low, guttural groan vibrated through the building's foundation, the sound of massive server banks undergoing a catastrophic thermal event. The lights in the laboratory flickered and died, replaced by the frantic strobing of the red emergency beacons. Karen watched the panic in the eyes of the guards as their encrypted comms dissolved into static. The digital empire of the Aegis Corporation was being ground into dust in real time. Grant let out a roar of frustration and lunged for a nearby terminal, his fingers stabbing at the keys in a futile attempt to quarantine the virus. Karen raised her pistol and fired into the main power distribution hub behind him. A brilliant blue arc of electricity erupted from the panel, showering Grant in sparks and molten copper. The room was plunged into a thick, suffocating darkness, filled with the smell of scorched insulation. Karen didn't wait to see if he was still standing. She turned and ran, her memory of the room's layout acting as her only guide. She found the heavy handle of the emergency exit and threw her weight against it. The hallway outside was a nightmare of red light and long, distorted shadows. She ran until her lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, the weight of Maya's body a constant, grounding pressure. Behind her, she heard the rhythmic thunder of boots on the concrete. She scrambled into a freight elevator, the doors closing just as the first flashlight beams hit the far end of the corridor. Marcus's voice crackled in her ear, distorted by the failing network. He told her he had bypassed the security locks on the parking garage. The elevator doors hissed open to reveal a cavernous space filled with rows of black vehicles. At the far end, a heavy armored SUV flashed its lights. Karen ran toward it, her boots skidding on a patch of oil. The doors unlocked with a sharp, mechanical click. She climbed into the driver's seat, the smell of expensive leather a jarring contrast to the chaos she'd just left. A glowing map appeared on the dashboard, showing a path out of the complex. She laid Maya across the back seat and threw her jacket over the shivering girl. She slammed the SUV into gear and floored the accelerator, the tires screaming as they grabbed the concrete. She steered the massive vehicle toward the glass doors of the main lobby. The sound of the impact was like a bomb going off. 1,000 shards of tempered glass raining down on the hood as they burst through into the night air. In her mirror, she saw the blue strobes of a dozen police cruisers, their sirens a frantic, rising wail. She yanked the wheel, diving into the dark, overgrown path that led into the forest. Karen drove with a white-knuckled intensity, the SUV's headlights cutting a narrow path through the dense pines. Behind her, the lights of the Aegis security teams were gaining ground. At that moment, her tablet chirped. The Omega virus had reached the satellite uplink. In the rearview mirror, she watched as the lead pursuit vehicle suddenly swerved, its steering and navigation systems failing as the network died. One by one, the Aegis SUVs veered off the road, crashing into the timber and disappearing into clouds of steam and dust. Karen kept her foot on the gas until the road ahead was silent and empty. She brought the vehicle to a stop at a rusted bridge over the St. Louis River, where Marcus's old white van was waiting in the fog. She stepped out into the cold air, the smell of the river and wet pine needles filling her senses. Marcus met her at the edge of the bridge. She handed him the final physical drive, the last piece of Jericho data in existence. Marcus placed the drive on the concrete railing and brought a heavy sledgehammer down on it with a dull, final thud. Karen picked up a handful of the crushed plastic and metal and let it slip through her fingers into the black, rushing water below. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her old smartphone and her cluster of electronic keys. The screen flickered once with a notification and then went dark. She threw the devices far out into the river, watching the small splash before they were swallowed by the current. Every digital thread that connected her to the world was now severed. To any database or surveillance camera, Karen Whitman no longer existed. She turned back to the van where Maya was sleeping, feeling a strange, terrifying sense of peace. Months later, Karen stood in a clearing in the Canadian wilderness, the rhythmic thwack of her axe echoing through the trees. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and cedar. She wiped the sweat from her forehead and looked toward the small log cabin they now called home. Maya sat on the porch steps, her head bent over a sketchbook as she drew the mountains with a steady, confident hand. There were no screens here, no cameras, no hidden monitors. Karen gathered an armful of wood and headed inside. The weight of the logs, a solid, honest burden. She closed the heavy oak door and slid the iron bolt into place, finally home.